The lawyer across the table from Gene Hartwell laughed. Actually laughed. It was not a mean laugh. It was a confused laugh. The kind of laugh that happens when someone hears something they cannot quite believe. "You are telling me," the lawyer said, shaking his head, "that you have no written agreement. No contract. Nothing on paper. Just a handshake from 1962? Gene nodded. He did not know why this was funny. A handshake meant something. It always had. To him anyway. The lawyer was working for a big agribusiness company called Midwest Land Solutions. This company had just bought 3,000 acres of prairie grassland in Nebraska. Land that Gene Hartwell had used for his cattle ranch for 46 years. Based on a handshake deal. Based on a promise made in 1962 when Gene was 18 years old and the land belonged to a man named Robert Caldwell. Now Caldwell was dead. His family had sold the land. And the new owners wanted Gene off. They wanted to turn the pasture into a different kind of operation. They offered him $3 million to leave. Gene said no. The lawyer could not believe it. Nobody said no to $3 million. It was 1962 when the story really began. Gene was a teenager, just finished with high school, and his father had died that year. His father's death came suddenly and shocked everyone. One day his father was working in the fields. The next day he was gone. Gene's mother was devastated. She did not know anything about running a ranch. She did not know how to manage animals or crops or money. Gene had to grow up fast. He had to take over the family ranch while he was still young and scared and grieving. It was a small operation. Not much land. Not much money. Just Gene, his mother, and some cattle that needed grazing space to survive. The cattle needed grass to eat. Without grass, the cattle would starve. Without the cattle, the family would starve. It seemed impossible. There was no way for a teenager to make this work alone. His neighbor, Robert Caldwell, owned big stretches of beautiful prairie grassland that he was not using for anything. The land was gorgeous green prairie. Caldwell was a kind man. An old man in his 70s who had lived a good life. He had known Gene's father for many years. He had worked alongside Gene's father long ago before Gene was born. He understood what it meant to lose a parent and have to take over a family business as a kid. He had been young once too and remembered how hard it was. So one day, Caldwell called Gene over. They stood together in the field on a warm spring day. The grass was tall and green. Birds were singing in the breeze. Caldwell pointed to his grass and his land. "You can use this land," Caldwell said, "for grazing your cattle. As long as you need it. For as long as you live." Gene asked nervously, "How much will you charge?" Caldwell looked at him with kindness in his eyes. "Nothing," Caldwell said. "Your father was a good man. This is for him. And for you." They shook hands. That was it. No lawyers. No paperwork. No signatures. No contracts. Just two men, standing in a field, making a deal with a handshake. Gene said, "Thank you." Caldwell said, "You are family now." That handshake kept Gene's ranch alive. That handshake saved Gene's mother and gave Gene a future when he had none. Gene used that land for the next 46 years. Every spring he moved his cattle there. Every summer he checked on them carefully. He maintained the fences and cared for the grassland like it was his own. Because in a way, it was his. He had made a deal. A real deal. The kind that meant something. Caldwell died in 1987. Gene attended the funeral and sat in the church remembering the handshake that had saved his life when he was 18 and scared. Caldwell's family knew about the agreement and honored it. Caldwell's son, Robert Jr., became the owner. He was more business-minded than his father, but he respected the deal his father had made. Years went by and Gene and Robert Jr. developed a friendly understanding. They would see each other at town events and church. The agreement was part of the land's history and part of what made the ranch work and kept Gene's family alive. Then in 2006, Robert Jr. decided to sell. The land market was booming and Midwest Land Solutions made a strong offer. Robert Jr. could not refuse. When the new owners took over, they contacted Gene and said the agreement would end. They wanted to use the land differently. Gene explained he had a handshake deal from 1962. The company offered him money to leave. First $500,000. Gene said no. Then $1 million. Still no. $2 million. No. Finally $3 million. Gene's wife Margaret begged him to consider it. That was more money than they would ever see. But Gene said no to all of it. The company got frustrated and said they would take him to court. Gene agreed. Let a judge decide. What happened next surprised everyone. Gene hired a lawyer named Sarah Martinez. She was young and smart. She had just opened her own practice in town. She had never heard of a case like this. A handshake deal from 1962. No paperwork. No witnesses at the time except 2 dead men. She was not sure it could win in court. The legal odds seemed impossible. But Gene was calm about it. He spoke quietly and with confidence. My word is good, he said. And I can prove it. Sarah started researching late into the night. She found something important in Nebraska law. Old cases. Cases from decades ago. Cases where handshake agreements had been upheld in court if there was proof that the deal was real. If people acted on it. If they honored it for years and years. Gene had proof. He had 46 years of proof. He had used the land every single year. He had paid property taxes on improvements he made. He had maintained the property carefully. He had treated it like his own. All the neighbors knew about the deal. It was common knowledge throughout the county. This was stronger evidence than people thought. Sarah became convinced that Gene could win. She began building her case piece by piece. She gathered documents. She found witnesses. She prepared arguments. She worked harder on this case than any other case in her young career. She knew this was about more than just land or money. This was about whether a man's word still meant something in America. The case went to court in 2007. Gene was 73 years old. Midwest Land Solutions had expensive lawyers and corporate resources. The company's lawyers argued that without a written contract, the agreement was not real. They said oral agreements were not reliable. Gene was just trying to get free land, they claimed. But then Sarah called Gene to the witness stand. He looked small there. An old man with withered hands and a farmer's tan. He wore his best church clothes, not a fancy suit like the lawyers. He spoke slowly and carefully about 1962. He described Robert Caldwell. He described the field and the handshake. He described how he had used that land every single year for 46 years. He described how he had told his children about the deal and how they learned about keeping promises. His voice did not waver. Everyone in the courtroom could see he was telling the truth. Then Sarah called witnesses. Old neighbors who had known Gene his whole life and remembered the agreement. Cattlemen who had seen Gene's cattle on Caldwell's land for decades and could testify to it. Bank records showing Gene's taxes and investments in property improvements. Records of fence repairs and maintenance Gene had done. Evidence of community knowledge. People from the town who knew about the arrangement. The case became clear to everyone watching it. This was not a man trying to steal land. This was not someone being dishonest. This was a man who had honored a deal his whole life. A man who had kept his word when the other person died. A man who had maintained the agreement through 4 decades of changes. His word was his bond. The judge listened carefully to everything. The judge was old enough to understand what a handshake meant. The judge understood that some contracts are real even without paper. The judge had lived long enough to see men keep their promises. On October 15, 2007, the judge ruled in Gene's favor. The handshake deal from 1962 was binding and legal. Midwest Land Solutions lost the case. They had to allow Gene to continue using the land for the rest of his life. The company did not accept the first decision. They appealed. They hired even more expensive lawyers. They filed motion after motion. Gene kept showing up to every hearing. He kept telling his story. He kept proving that his word was good. The appeal took over a year. During that time, Gene wondered if he had made a mistake. Had he been too stubborn? Should he have taken the $3 million and retired like his wife wanted? His wife Margaret asked him once, "Do you ever regret it?" Gene thought carefully. Then he said, "Margaret, if I took that money, I would have $3 million and no honor. With honor, I have everything I need." In March 2008, the appeals court upheld the original decision. The handshake agreement was legal and binding. Midwest Land Solutions could not force Gene off the land. The court decided that a man's word, kept for 46 years, was more valuable than any contract. The story spread. Local news covered it. Then state news. Then national news picked it up. The image of an old man who refused $3 million to keep a promise made 46 years ago became famous. People called him. People wanted to write stories about him. Universities wanted to study his case in law schools. It became a famous case. Hartwell versus Midwest Land Solutions. It was taught in classrooms. It showed that in America, a man's word could still matter. That promises still meant something. That honor was real. Gene did not become rich from the case. He did not sue the company for money or damages. He just wanted to use the land. His land. The land that Robert Caldwell had trusted him with in 1962 with nothing but a handshake. Gene lived another 8 years after the court victory. He continued to run his cattle operation. He used the grassland the way he always had. He told his story when people asked about it. He told it to his grandchildren so they would understand that promises matter. That your word is the most important thing you have. That you have to keep your agreements, even when it is hard. Even when people offer you money to break them. Even when the law at first says you are wrong. Gene Hartwell died in 2016. He was 92 years old. His obituary mentioned the court case. It mentioned the $3 million he had refused. It mentioned the handshake deal from 1962. It mentioned that he had proved that a man's word still matters. When Gene died, his children inherited the ranch. And they still use the grassland that Robert Caldwell gave to their father with a handshake in 1962. The deal is still honored. The agreement lives on. Not because of a piece of paper, but because of a man who kept his word. The story of Gene Hartwell teaches something important. In a world of contracts and lawyers and big companies and $3 million offers, there is still power in a handshake. There is still power in keeping that promise year after year. Even when the person who made the promise is dead. Even when the land changes hands. Gene proved that your word matters. That keeping promises is the strongest thing a person can do. It is stronger than money. It is stronger than corporate power. In the end, Gene won because his word was good. Because he had kept a promise for 46 years. When he stood in front of a judge and told the truth, it was obvious. A handshake in 1962 was worth more than $3 million in 2007. And the law agreed.